Firstly, thanks very much for joining us with our webinar today, IRATE about IR35. I think that it is fair to say that this is a huge subject and one that is dominating our industry at the moment. It is an absolute pleasure to be in a position where we can convey our thoughts and feelings to you. And today we're joined by a tax specialist from one of our partner organisations, M&S Accountancy Taxation. And it is Director Stewart McKinnon. So Stuart's going to join me today in order to deal with any technical questions around the issues of IR35. Say hello, Stuart.
Good afternoon, everyone. And yes, this has been on not so much on the back burner, but certainly come to the forefront over the last few months as the revenue ramp up the pressure with a view to introducing the new legislation, as we're going to discover almost imminently. We're not far away from that now. So yeah, my role is to sit here and provide some technical guidance and some thoughts about where this might be going over the next few months.
Stuart is an expert in this field, so if there are any questions at the end that are detailed concerning the legislation, Stuart is more than aptly equipped in order to answer them. Today, our format is going to be very conversational from our two perspectives. We have got a simple agenda to follow. We simply want to give you an overview and an outline as to what IR35 is. We want to put some depth to it with regard to what does it mean if you're a contractor and if you're a client. We want to then give you a view as to, well, what are these determinants and how do we ultimately understand them with regard to potentially assessing our situations? And at the same time, looking forward with regard to, well, what changes do we need to consider as an industry and as contractors and clients in order to actually accommodate the upcoming legislation that is due for release in April 6th, 2020. So informal, but we have got a few slides. We'll rattle on. I think that the first one is really with regard to an overview of IR35 and to share, I suppose, a headline view as to what it is and where it has come from. IR35 is not new. It has been around here since 2000, and I believe we're on our 5th iteration now of change. This is legislation that is designed to target tax avoidance by personal service companies. And that really is those who are disguised that are otherwise classed as an employee, but we seem to be disguised as something else. The government have really been looking at the issue of IR35 and have tested in April 17 within the public sector the off-payroll workers legislation. That has had a really bumpy start, seems to have settled down. The government are saying, the HMRC are saying that it's had a positive impact and that it has claimed somewhere in the order of £400 million of income to the Treasury. So with that, the emphasis has been placed on widening this out across the wider industry. And this is what ultimately we're facing in April 2020. The reasons why this has come about, well, our economy has changed. Over the last 30 years, the employment markets, labour markets have changed hugely. The gig economy has driven up areas of tax non-compliance, and at the same time, just really through mostly self-employment. The HMRC is very keen to tag that and to stop that with the view of somewhere in the order of £1.2 billion shortfall is currently what they're estimating could be the gain here. So slowly, we are getting moved down a route where options with regard to non-compliance with legislation are minimal. So this is something that ultimately the government has been thinking about for a considerable period of time and is steadily moving through a process of enforcement.
Yeah, I think what I would probably just say to add to that is that where the government are hoping to take the legislation now is basically where they intended it to be 19 years ago. But it's taken a long time to get there. But that's the key aim now.
The timeline and the impact. Well, I think it's very important for us to understand who this covers, who it impacts, and ultimately the timeline of implementation here. This has been talked about for a long time. I've been involved in consultations with the HMRC myself through the course of 2019. We were really expecting the parliamentary and royal assent to be given to this legislation in the autumn, i.e. November, I think was expected of this year. However, with the scenario where we are at the moment, with a general election being called, with Brexit having been moved to the 31st of January, this legislation has not to date received royal assent. And on the back of that, it's hanging there still as to whether it will do and whether it will receive it in time in order for it to be implemented successfully in April 2020. So there is some doubt about this at the moment. And I know that there have been certain organisations that have been lobbying the government in order to defer the implementation of this legislation for a further 12 months. So time has we've yet to have time to see what the outcome of that will be. And ultimately, I think there's still a considerable amount of doubt around that as to whether it will be implemented by April 2020. And many of us, I think, will probably sit here listening to this and thinking, here's hoping there is a deferment for 12 months.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, this is detailed legislation that's affecting many, many people. And as a tax specialist sitting in the background, it's fundamental to get this right, because all too often what's happened in the past is HMRC have introduced legislation, and then over the next 2 or 3 years have got to go back and tinker with it to bring it to the way it was originally intended. And it makes, certainly from this side of the fence, complete common sense to defer it for 12 months, to give the legislation time to come into force, and for everybody to be comfortable with what it means. Where the timetable we have at the moment, I think, is simply just going to be far too rushed.
Indeed. So who this applies to, I think that over the course of the last year, I've been talking to many contractors and to many clients, and there has been a real confusion as to who this applies to. Let us be clear, this applies only to limited companies, personal service companies who are operating within our market. It doesn't apply to umbrella organisations, it doesn't apply to sole traders or pay-away workers. So it's simply PSCs. Now that is a good section of our market, and ultimately it's going to have quite a broad impact across how we provide our services. In terms of the companies, the government have been quite cute, in my opinion, with regard to the fact that they've only made this applicable to medium and large organisations. And they've classed this as turnover over 10.2 million, having an excess of 5.1 million on your balance sheet, or having an excess of 50 or more employees. So really, it looks like they've been favourable to the smaller company here, but in reality, the smaller company doesn't hire that many contractors, typically, in my experience, therefore is falling out with this and is null and void. So the government have been, they look as if they've given some kind of dispensation here, but in essence, it's a very cleverly placed one, in my opinion. What do you think, Stuart?
Yeah, I think that's, they've been seen to be trying to support small business along the lines of what's sitting behind the intended legislation in terms of feedback that's come forward. But ultimately, they've no intention of allowing a lot of people to wriggle out of this, because they want as big a tax take as they can, and that's what's behind all of this. Maybe just a couple of points to emphasise just on who this applies to. It's very much aimed at the determination as the Companies Act legislation, but if you do have a large unincorporated client, the key test for them will be turnover only, so they're looking at the 10.2 million turnover, so that might apply to some big partnerships out there. The other thing, just on the 50 employees or more, there's uncertainty at this stage on whether the deemed employees who are actually caught by the legislation would actually be brought into this. Looking at it as things stand, and given that the deemed employees don't actually qualify as employees in terms of employment rights, you would think they would be excluded, but this is something that HMRC have still actually got to clarify there. One other point to make is that where companies are small and are engaging PSCs, then in those situations, nothing changes, and the responsibility for complying rests with the PSC, not with the end client in that situation.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the headliners of what we believe are the things that we should all be aware of with regard to the oncoming legislation, and certainly what has been defined for us thus far. Over the course of the last 6 months, I've been traveling widely talking to clients and to contractors, as I say, about this. And what has amazed me is the confusion around the most basic and embryonic point here, and that is the fact that the movement of the determination of the IR35 status is moving from the worker to the client. Now, that is one of the biggest changes of all. And I'm finding that our clients sometimes are a little bit challenged in terms of the take-up on that and what that means to them. Some of them are integrating contractors into the decision-making process as well. But by law, it is the clients that ultimately has to determine. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that if the assignment falls within IR35, then it is the fee payer. Now, that is typically the agency or an umbrella, who have to do the payee, NIC, and potentially EMI tax deductions here. It only applies to the day rate, excluding the VAT, and we'll talk a wee bit more examples later on with regard to the other physical deductions that occur here, and Stuart's got some working examples that we can work through with you. The other things we have to consider here is that if the end hire doesn't make a determination or doesn't pass it on to the last point of pay, the fee payer, or makes an incorrect one, then it is the end hirer who is going to be liable for absorbing the unpaid taxes and NI of that worker. So the liabilities and the risks increase by not following the legislation and not having due processes in place in order to manage this. The other thing to consider here is that from a fee payer's perspective, i.e. an agency, should we not action the determination and have the processes inherent and correct within our own businesses, then we are going to be the person or the company that is ultimately liable for the payment of taxes and NI. And the final thing as a headliner, in order to overview what the legislation is going to detail, is the fact that there has to be a disagreement process formally instigated within organizations who hire contractors and are making these types of assessments. Now, it's imperative that this agreement process is put in and is thought through and followed what the legislation will outline. We see the disagreement process being of ultra importance moving forward, because ultimately, as this legislation beds in, clients, I feel, are going to find the contractors are going to challenge determinations that put them inside IR35, and the rules and regs around this disagreement process need to be followed acutely and accurately. So our customers, we are advising them that they have to have a well thought through disagreement process, because I have no doubt at all that this will be actively actioned once we get into this period of legislation being implemented.
And I think I would agree with Gareth on that. PSCs are not wanting to be caught by this legislation, and in many cases there will be a natural concern for them that they're hit with almost a blanket ban or a blanket coverage on here, and it would be necessary to step back and actually have a look at the individual circumstances in each contract. That's what the engager is ultimately meant to do. And linked to that, there's a big responsibility on the engager, who's required under the legislation, or will be required under the legislation, to take reasonable care. And that's actually a very important aspect. And reasonable care means not applying a blanket coverage to anybody, but showing that they've looked at each individual contract that they've got in place in arriving at their determination. Now, linked to this, one of the great tools that literally the revenue believe they have is CEST, the Check Employment Status Toolkit that's out there. Now, literally as we speak, that is in the process of being updated by HMRC just now. Those of us that have been involved in this for a long time are very sceptical about the use of CEST. It's known to be heavily biased and doesn't actually ask many of the key questions that are required. And even the new updated version doesn't do that either. As we'll go on and cover in a minute, one of the key tests that have been upheld by the courts over the years is something known as Mutuality of Obligations. And CEST, even as it is amended, does not actually cover off that aspect at all. So CEST is going to, when looking at reasonable care, HMRC are probably almost certainly going to insist that they have evidence that the end user has either used CEST or something similar to that. And I think Gareth and I have been talking about how other parties will probably be looking to develop their own version of the toolkit. And I think that, again, should be something that engagers should be relying on and certainly considering in order to give them protection under this reasonable care, that they've actually looked at matters properly under it all. One other thing, just from perhaps more from the contractor's perspective, when they do receive a determination, they actually have 45 days in which to, it's not called an appeal, but make it known that they object to the determination that they've received. So 45 days is a key timeline within that. It's also worth bearing in mind that whilst that goes on, if the determination is to be to deduct PYE and NIC, then that is what the engager is obliged to do. There's no temporary suspension of those rules while the determination is being read into. And ultimately, if we do get to the situation, the HMRC will be the end arbiter in a determination dispute.
So what we're going to do now is talk about the determinants. We have isolated it down to what we believe to be the 5 key determinants, and what we're going to do is just discuss loosely as to what they are, the impact they could have, and ultimately taking a view as to how these determinants might be the solution with regard to the implementation of this moving forward. So Stewart and I will do, I think, a joint piece on this one, because I think that from right to substitution, in the past, it was absolutely acceptable to have a clause within your contract that said there was the right to substitute. But that's all it did. It just said there was a right. It didn't say anything about the process. It didn't say anything about permissions. Didn't say anything about the payment and how this should be gone about in detail of how that substitute could be managed. The revenue have challenged this and challenged it heavily. It is no longer going to be applicable to just have that cover-all type of clause within your contract to be seen to be giving you the right of substitution. There has to be more thorough thought applied to this. There has to be a detailed process as to how do we go about implementing a substitute? How will the substitute be managed? What will the substitute do? What will be the delivery and the deliverables and the tasks required during the substitution period? How do we go about paying that? Because that payment has to be made from the original PSC to the substitute. There cannot be any interaction from the fee payer directly to the substitute. It has to be handled in a very succinct chain. So with that, there has to be an upgrade with regard to our thought around substitution, and also from a contractor and from a client's perspective, an understanding of what is required for the future, and an ability and willingness to accept that and to work with that, I think, is going to be key.
I think so. And the problem is, we've seen in many cases that have come across our way with regard to contracts, quite understandably, many clients or end users have sought, they want the services of the individuals, of you guys that are there, and therefore many of the contracts nowadays have a named individual within it. Now, that's given the revenue a huge in on this side of it, and saying that, well, and say, none of these factors are understandable for confidentiality, for security. That's what the end user is looking for, and you don't want just anybody turning up on your premises on a Monday morning and saying, well, I'm here and I'm going to sit down and cover that off. But there's going to have to be some relaxation of that side of things if the right to substitution is going to apply. The revenue have won cases where there have been either named individuals, and certainly going back to the CEST toolkit and other aspects in there, it's a huge negative in their mind if there is a named individual, or the end user actually has control over who the substitute is, and if they have the right to say no to it, then that's going to be detrimental to when looking at the status determination.
Nextly, supervision, direction and control, otherwise known as SDC, over the last 20 years. This is really about the assessment of the level of management, in essence, the level of integration that a contractor worker would have into the permanent staff. Are they managed? Are they seen as an equivalent or a like person who is a permanent member of staff? So it really is about the level of day-to-day control and management. Simply, that is it. And I think what the revenue doing here is pressing on the back of the fact, can we prove that you treat them the same as a permanent employee? If so, they should be taxed in an equivocal way. So what we need to be looking at here for the future is really about the relaxation of the level of management we have on contract workers, and to put new processes and thoughts in place with regard to managing them like external consultants as such.
Yeah, and I think this is an area that actually there can be some very clear-cut cases, but probably the revenue, it's not something the revenue are actually very strong on in winning cases. More recently, I don't know, people have been following these issues out there, but the BBC and ITV have been under the microscope for many of the contracts that they've got or had with their stars, if we call them as such. Now, the revenue had a real clampdown in this area, and most recently there's been 8 cases taken to the courts. What the revenue don't like publicised is the fact they've only won 2 of them. And actually only one of those cases they won centred around control. That was involving Krista Ackroyd. But when you actually sit and understand, you can see why there was control in this case. She had a 7-year contract with the BBC. She was contracted for 45 weeks per annum, and she was restricted on additional work that she could take out with the BBC. Now compare that to another recent case involving Albatel, which is actually Lorraine Kelly's company. And actually what was sitting there within the notes, within HMRC's notes, which they conveniently overlooked, was that Lorraine Kelly could actually have complete control over how she chose to provide the programme. So she had almost editorial freedom, who her guests were going to be, all that type of thing was covered within there. And that's those are very important determinants, that ability to decide what you're going to do without undue influence from others. And the courts over the years have placed a very heavy emphasis on that side of things. Probably something closely linked to what we've got here just now. It was a Department of Works and Pension case, ironically, before the public authority legislation came in. But within that, there was a highly skilled IT professional, but that was actually held. There was little or no supervision involved in there. This was a skill set that the individual had that was not within the organisation, and all these aspects helped build up the fact that there was little or no control. The individual could work from home, he could come into the premises. So there was a whole range of factors within there. And without wanting to bore people on tax cases, the great thing about those is they set some very important precedents that we can follow and use to plan ahead, as we'll see later on.
Tax boring age joking soon. Financial risk. Well, we're all aware of what financial risk, but how do we apply it to our sector and to the work that we do? Well, within IT, defect management, i.e. you make something, you develop software, for example, you leave it with a customer, 3 months down the line, there is some kind of an issue with it. The contractual arrangement to have the obligation to come back and fix that would be deemed to be financial risk. So that is something that many of our contracts have at the moment. But certainly it is something that I think is going to be absolutely required in the future, as that is going to ultimately be one of the determinants to validate that you are providing a service to a client that falls out with IR35. I think you have a view on early terminal bonuses or early delivery bonuses as well, Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, early delivery bonuses, all those aspects that sit there, it's been suggested one of the big banks that are putting a lot of the people out there, particularly for their software developers, there's an understanding that they will not be paid unless a key deliverable happens. Now, that is not the way that's a major departure from where they are just now, and undoubtedly that involves real financial risk. If that deliverable is not met, then the PSC is actually going to be not receive anything until that arrives. So if people now that's a very different approach to how things are at the moment with regard to timesheets going in, payments within set timescales. But if we are going to shake off the shackles of this new legislation, then it's going to require give and take on both sides, and certainly for the PSC, this is the type of thing that they're going to have to shoulder upon them, be prepared to shoulder upon themselves, so that the legislation doesn't apply.
Okay. Part and parcel of the organisation is yet again another one. It's really the length and the frequency. We have got, having done this for nearly 27 years, I have had contractors working on sites, I think at the maximum was 15 years in one case. But even this morning I was at a customer and they were referring to contractors that they currently have on site who have been there from 2013. Our view is that this cannot be sustained moving forward. There has to be a view with regard to the length of the requirement and the frequency of hire of contractor workers. I think organisations need to ultimately have a view and a policy potentially with regard to rotation of contractors. And the rotation of contractors across the market, I think, will be a very good thing for the sector as a whole. Do you have a view with regard to what the perfect length and frequency would be from a tax perspective, sir?
I mean, that again is probably not, because the courts have actually looked at a range of different ones over there. In an ideal scenario, I must admit, it's not the length and frequency as such. What I would be looking at, trying to get right, is the key deliverable. Now, behind that, the engager and the PSC will have a good idea of how long a deliverable will take. But that's how I would be looking to sit down and do it and determine it that way. The more that you can take away either the shorter the length of the contract, the frequency of the contract, the ability to take on other workers, the more this is going to strengthen your hand in saying that this doesn't apply. Again, almost linking that in, yes, it does involve perhaps another element of financial risk in here. And I think undoubtedly over the last few years, many people, as Gareth has indicated, 15 years, have probably seen as many at that end, but people have not moved around much on the back of it because they've had that security and perhaps the enjoyment of working on particular contracts. That's understandable, but in those situations, they're going to be caught under the legislation. Other things, and I'll be the taxman that's a killjoy in amongst that. If the PSCs actually get invited along to the Christmas party, that all the other workers are attending, then sorry, I'll only say what HMRC are doing. They would actually argue that that seems to be treated as part and parcel of the organisation. So the killjoy there says, sorry, you can't be invited to the Christmas party this year. Other aspects of that, perhaps either internal email addresses, how you're represented to the clients, external clients or suppliers, if you're part and parcel of the organisation. These are all things that you've got to be careful of now, and certainly things that HMRC have held out when they've gone to challenge individuals on this type of situation.
We mentioned mutuality of obligation earlier on about the fact that the CESS tool wasn't particularly detailed with regard to assessing this one determinant.
Yeah.
I think in my experience, this is a determinant that confuses most people just by the wording, to be quite frank. It really is about the proving of an employment relationship, but also beyond that, it's about that obligation from one party to receive work from the other, and for the client to have the obligation to offer that work. And where the revenue are targeting in this is that if that relationship occurs, where it's a proven relationship for the provision of that work, then that would fall within IR35. It's a complicated one. I think it is quite difficult to assess and to measure by the sheer nature of the fact that the CESS tool doesn't detail and cover it, I think says it all. However, it is one as a sector that we should be very mindful of, and we should be building some deep thoughts into what this means and potentially what future solutions may look like to fit TUMO.
Yeah, and I think that that's there. The revenue don't actually like to accept mutuality of obligation, hence one of the reasons it's not involved in CEST. But they have their own internal manuals, and these internal manuals do reluctantly acknowledge that mutuality of obligation exists. It should do, because the revenue have lost so many cases in the courts over it. But the basics of what we're looking at is that the engager must be obliged to pay remuneration, and the worker must be obliged to carry out the worker's skill required. In other words, they haven't got the right to say no. Further, where we can look at this is if a project is either delayed or it's the idea where the engager can come along and actually redirect the individual and get them to undertake either other work, or even if there is no work, for the PSC or individual to turn up, be on the premises and receive payment for that. That's where the mutuality of obligation is, and that's where there's effectively a deemed employer-employee relationship. Grey areas in there, payment of retainers, I've seen those happen. Not really, I would try and avoid retainers if it's all possible. Again, that lends itself to this idea that you're always being paid to be part of the organisation. There's an employer-employee relationship there. So it implies a contract of service, and that indicates employment. And I think the other thing, going back to almost the 15-year one that we've got there, it's this keeping mutuality of obligations, the familiarity between the PSC and the engager, that's going to be caught. And I think underpinning probably all of the key tests that we've actually got here today, what criteria determine IR35, we're certainly looking at this and saying, well, what does the contract state? And yes, the contract is important because there can be aspects within there that can be fatal to any determination. But in many cases, and what really the courts have done, is they've looked beyond the written contract itself, and you've got to look at the facts of the situation. So the contract in itself is not the only solution. It has to be able to show that actually represents what's going on in the ground.
We have got lots of questions rattling in at the minute. Our beautiful assistant Michael here is sitting taking notes wildly. Keep firing them in. We'll get to the questions at the end. But what we thought we'd do now is to actually look at some live working examples of, well, what does this mean to me as a worker? If this comes into play, I am here now, what's the future going to look like? So Stewart has kindly worked out a couple of examples, worked on the premise of PSC working within our sector on £300 a day and £500 a day. I'll let Stewart talk through the deductions and ultimately how he has arrived at the bottom lines.
Right. Yeah, and I really wanted to, because the key aspect for many of the contractors that are out here today, what's it going to mean in my pocket, and what other things are going to change? And part of this is the daily rate. But for many who actually work away, one of the other key changes in amongst all of this is that under an employment relationship, the travel to and from a place of work is deemed an ordinary commute. And so therefore any costs related to that, including accommodation costs while staying away, these are no longer going to qualify. So they can potentially have a very significant hit on individuals as well, albeit that the engager's not paying for those, but those qualify for tax relief in most circumstances in the PSC's own accounts and tax returns. And so I've factored in here that at the moment, somebody that may just have travel costs, £50 per week. There are particular rules. This centres on something known as temporary workplaces and permanent workplaces. And while an engager, while a PSC is involved in a contract, and generally that's of an undefined term and it's less than 24 months, then the travel to and from that place of work will qualify for the tax relief on the travel costs. Without a doubt, from 6th of April 2020, if the new legislation comes into place, that is not going to happen. And therefore, what I've done, building through those calculations here, the two that you see in your screen at the moment, is to let you see where that difference is. And to take the current optimum, the way a lot of people have set this up is that not only is the individual involved within the PSC, but perhaps a spouse or partner is in there. Now that's used to take advantage of potentially salaries. It takes account of basic rate bands. In Scotland, that kicks in at just over £43,000. So what we're actually sitting down looking at here is to sit and say, well, at this moment in time, an individual maximising what's come into the company, and the key factor here is drawing all the income from it. At this moment in time, they'll end up in a £300 day rate, £50,600. Now, if they take all that as an individual, don't actually have spouse or partner involved in the company, we're just on about 49.5. Ultimately, where are we going to? £42,000. And as we can sit and see, that's a hit of almost £8,000 for a family or an individual in those circumstances. And then when we apply the same principles to a much higher rate, you can see the differential becomes even more significant. And that's because currently the spouse, partner, shareholder, whatever, has got the ability to their own personal allowance and receive up to £50,000 of dividend income without actually incurring a higher rate tax charge. So that all that income that can come into the company at the moment can be taken out without involving any higher rate tax at all. That's not going to be the case. The spouse, partner, from 6th of April 2020 becomes irrelevant in the calculations because it's all applied on the individual behind the PSC. And as I say, we can see a difference in those circumstances of over £20,000, unfortunately.
That's a measurable difference indeed. So these are working examples. It's fine to talk theory with regard to what the legislation looks like, what it means, but this is really what it results in. And having that understanding is absolutely key. But at the same time, as a contractor, I wouldn't be panicking. There is still a very strong view that there is a lot of work that is going to remain out with. And I think what we will see is the market aligning once this legislation comes live. So that takes us on to our final slide, which is really about the future considerations and the solutions that we as a sector should be considering. I have been thinking about this a lot in the last year, as you can imagine. And one of the things that really I've been thinking about is that, well, this is tax legislation that cannot be hidden or outran. We have to adopt and embrace and deal with, but at the same time understand. And with that understanding, think about, right, well, are we doing things in the right way? We obviously want to be operating to the tune of the law in every way. But is there other ways that we could operate as a sector, as businesses and as PSCs that ultimately could give us options here? And from my perspective, I've been talking to our clients about determining what type of resource you need. There needs to be a greater definition around it. Do I need contractors? And if I do, well, let's get them in to do some very specific jobs and use them intelligently. And in doing so, limit any future liability and any future risk by ensuring that we're engaging them for the right type of work through the right route and defining the deliverables, which is probably the most important thing that I can deliver today, in order to give that clarity of what is expected. The next thing is to look at the definition around what it is. You know, we as an industry have been very loose for a long, long time with the schedules of services on the back of contracts that have been light, to say the least. They have detailed 1, 2, 3 lines over a 6-month contract with regard to a physical deliverable. That is now no longer going to be sufficient. There has to be a greater level of contribution from our clients in order to really detail this deliverable down, to fit tasks and timelines against it, and to ensure that this is fitted tightly and managed tightly within the constraints of the contract. You know, so this definition is really important, and in many ways, this definition exists in our world. You know, whether it be a project initiation documents, statement of work, you know, a lot of definition around Specific projects and specific roles probably already exist. We just need to see it coming through the chain on a more regular basis. We need to have a wider acceptance of offering financial risk, the management of defects, etc., as we were outlining earlier. There has to be a view that contractor workers in the future have to be looked at like third-party consultants, like you got from a big SI, and that you manage them accordingly. So with that, there has to be new management procedures put into place. We have to separate contractors from permanent workforce. We have to define the roles in a more accurate way. So this will take some quite high-level thinking within the larger businesses who hire a large number of contractors in order to realign the mentality of management to adopt new procedures and to manage these third-party workers in an appropriate fashion. Customers I've talked to about substitution. The customers are thinking, not sure I want to hand over that right as to losing the right of who will be the substitute. There's a discomfort in the market about that, and I get it, I clearly get it. However, moving forward, if you were to bring in an SI to do a piece of work as a customer, and they were going to swap their resource in and out, there are provisions within the contracts of engagement there that allow for that swapping of resource. I think that implementing such a model moving forward for contractors may seem like a large hurdle for clients at the minute, but I think in the long term, they will see the benefit of this and ultimately the reduction of liability and risk and potentially the increase of flexibility of the workforce that they can attract.
Yeah, and I think the substitution clause is going to be important. And the reason that there's been a lot of focus on substitution is that historically, a properly applied substitution clause is seen to actually be an end determinant. If that's in place, end of it, you don't need to look any further. And I think the difficulty we're going to have now is even if a client, the engager, doesn't actually want that, what I would probably actually sit down and stress is that if many of the other parts that we're actually looking at on the screen here, the other key determinants are in place, then not having that substitution clause in place on its own is not fatal to the outcome. It helps the other way, but it's not absolutely fatal in anything that we're looking at. Where it would be was if this was the only aspect of the determinants that we were holding out to be. So in other words, if we already had control, there was a lack of financial risk in place, then actually the substitution clause would be fundamental to the outcome at that point.
So it's really about a blend.
Yeah, and I think that's
one on its own in essence.
Very much. What we're looking at here and what the courts have looked at over the years is one or two of these factors can have a very defining outcome. So if they're in place, that's fine, and substitution is one of those. But realistically, if you look at the background of most of the cases, they all filter back and forth between those and actually some other tests that are in there. One that we've not covered off today, but has been held to be important. We haven't covered it off because realistically probably doesn't apply for many of you guys there, but the provision of own equipment, for example, and the ability for somebody to turn up and actually have to provide specialist equipment to undertake the role. That's another one where it's been held by the courts over the years that is a key determinant of somebody being self-employed. But we haven't looked at it here because realistically we don't see that applying in many of the contracts that we've got.
I think that a lot of our clients are very reluctant for contractors to bring in their own hardware. It's obviously brings its own inherent risks. However, we could take a wider view. Say, for example, free and open source software. For example, if you were in as a worker and you were bringing some kind of innovation to a process, and you were bringing like some faults to the equation, I could argue potentially my side that I think that potentially could be viewed as use of own equipment. But there's a lot of detail to consider here. Time is moving on. The last point that we were going to talk about here was about the tenure and frequency of engagements. But I think we've talked about that and we're probably covered enough. We've got something like 17 questions lined up here with 16 minutes to go. So I think what we'll do is rattle on with the questions if you're in agreement, Stewart. So the first one is from Paul. If I spend 6 months of the year working overseas, do 2 short contracts in the UK, how could I be ever deemed a deemed employee? So spend 6 months of the year working overseas, doing 2 short contracts in the UK, how could I ever be deemed a deemed employee?
Now, it's interesting actually, where if somebody is considered non-resident, now that takes us on to another subject in itself, residency and the tests that apply for that. But it's a very important point, it's something I was going to cover off later on. This does not apply to non-residents. Now, 6 months, I have to sit down and say, might not be enough. What you've actually got to do is to look behind that and apply what's known as the statutory residence test. That will determine whether the individual worker is non-resident, and if non-resident, then yes, they'll not be a deemed employee, and the new legislation will apply.
Yeah. We have another question from Richard. Is there a difference between a substitute and a subcontractor? I think there is personally, but I think you're into legal territory here. I think whenever we get the legislation, I think it will define what a substitute means legally. And as such, I think that the substitute will be defined away from a subcontractor view. I see these as being 2 different elements myself, but that's my personal opinion. Do you have a view on it, sir?
Yeah, and it's probably it'll hinge on a legal viewpoint within there. Subcontractor actually changes, it's slightly different to a substitute as I'm sitting looking at it, because what it is that service is actually being put out to somebody else, and to an extent perhaps the main party or the PSC in those circumstances is actually really not making the client aware that there is a subcontract going on. Now, that aspect of it could also, depending on what's there, could actually in itself be caught by the new rules, depending on the status of the subcontract and other things as well. But it's really the way I would envisage seeing that is that the subcontract would actually be passing out some of that work. Now, in its own way, I would be very strongly arguing that helps, because it's demonstrating that worker is in business in their own right and is actually engaging in hiring other people to undertake it. It's slightly different, I think, to the substitution aspect, where there's more perhaps an indication that somebody's turning up on premises, for example, to undertake the work, or is directly tapping into the client system in some form. That's the way I would see it. What else have I got? I've got one from Gemma, who says most of our contractors are self-employed, which we believe are not affected by IR35. Where I would sit down and say that self-employed, yes. I mean, if we're talking about them as individuals, then as opposed to through a PSC, then we've got to understand that there's still actually an element of risk in those situations, because and that's between the employer who is looking at that situation and saying, have I actually got employees here? So IR35 as such, correct, that wouldn't be caught by the legislation, but the basics of actually taking on an employee, the rules and tests that we've got today would actually still apply to that individual, and the responsibility of getting them wrong, if they're not through a PSC, rests with the employer rather than the individual. Different story, I think we covered it off within here, that if it's the PSC themselves, they have the rules and they must continue, they must ensure compliance in those situations.
Okay. We have another question from Andy. Is it possible that the banks could reverse their current blanket approach at not engaging PSCs from early 2020 and start to conduct proper assessments? I think it's entirely likely, Andy. I think what we have seen coming out in the media is a lot of media hype in the recent few months. I think we have seen these blanketing statements coming out from the so-called large banks in the UK. and insurance companies, but I haven't seen it coming from any other areas, to be honest with you. These are organizations that hire many contractors. I think that they have potentially made a mistake, is my current feeling here, because what they're doing is highlighting themselves as potentially being unattractive places to work for PLCs moving forward. I think that the statements that have been released, and there's one particular bank in Edinburgh, and whenever I read it, I was thinking, oh, this is not good news, it's very damning. But when I got to the bottom of the statement, it actually indicated in the last few sentences that they were going to do individual assessments on every contractor to determine their position. Now, that would suggest to me that that's not a blanket approach. And as such, I think mediation has happened here, and they've hyped it up and maybe put a bit of a spin on it to be something maybe not fully the case. But the fact of the matter is that any hirer has to do a determination for each worker. And that is going to give an outcome, whether it be inside or outside, and it's going to be determined on the determinants and the type of work that the worker does. So is there going to be a future in working for banks in the future? I absolutely believe that there will be. I think it'll maybe look different, but I do see a reversing of this statement, yes.
And maybe just following up on that, I've got a question from Nicholas here. Can the responsibility of determining IR35 be transferred to the contractor if negotiated in the contract, or is that part non-negotiable? It's not. The legislation sets it very clear that it's the engager who must make that determination, and there's not going to be any going back on that. So no matter what's actually in the contract, the legislation will trump that, unfortunately, and that's what we're going to have to deal with.
It's a moving feast at the minute. There's another question from a bit here. Have FS companies shot themselves in the foot by saying they are applying a blanket approach? Yes, absolutely. How do we change organizations to use statement of works rather than job roles? Valid point and good question. This is going to be vital moving forward. As I said, the days of the two-line lazy statement of work and schedule of service is gone. There has to be the adoption of full and frank disclosure and expectation. There has to be deliverables, tasks, and timelines fitted to what is required from the worker. This is easily available in many organizations. It's sitting there in PIDs and SOWs already. It is about just converting it through the chain in order to give that level of detail, responsibility, and above all, accountability. That's going to be the key. So I think that organizations are going to be spirited to change. They will give more detail, but what it is going to come down to is encouragement and advice from people like ourselves within the sector in order to actually ensure that they're advised in a proper way and to minimize any liability and risks moving forward. That's one of our core rules here. So hopefully that answers your question a bit. Good question.
Yeah, and I think probably just building on that point, there's something just at the outset here. It's planning for this properly and being prepared to invest both some time and perhaps costs to get it right, because doing so could actually enhance the existing relationship between all parties involved in here, in addition to negating any of the tax effects that are coming through the legislation. So proper planning, engagement now, I think are really important, and it's worth taking that advice, providing you yourselves as the engager can see that there's some benefit and flexibility. I think the difficulty is if you can't see yourself being able to meet any of these issues that are there, then yes, you're going to be left high and dry. But if not, then it's worth actually working around all of those just now. I've got another question here. Are internal email addresses a no-no, or can these be cases where they can be defended as required? And yes, I think going back into all the tests here, they can certainly be defended, and there are reasons. It's only one factor that would be looked at, and probably not a hugely significant one on its own, but it's looked at in the entirety. And if the internal email address was the only thing that was holding you back and all the other boxes were ticked, I wouldn't be concerned about it in that situation. But could this be the straw that breaks the camel's back? It potentially could be, if not all the other tests are met. Another question from Mark. How did the HMRC
get to the £400 million figure for the public sector? Honestly, I don't know. I think it was an expectation and a target that they had. From what I understand, I've asked for proof and on this and some evidence with regard to the validity of the claim, and I've received none. They're still disputing it. They're still claiming £400 million has been made, but there's no evidence, Mark. So good question, but I can't give you a true and frank answer, I'm afraid.
No, and neither can HMRC. That's because in amongst all of that, unfortunately, over the years, their credibility in a lot of figures has now been thrown out and has to be challenged by the profession. And another common one that's out there is something known as the tax gap, which is meant to run into billions of pounds, but the revenue themselves can never, when asked, can never actually prove that either. Another question I've got here, but I believe the new CES tool tells you you're outside IR35 if you select substitution. I don't think so. There are several questions within substitution, and certainly the new aspect of CES on that actually asks whether it's the individual is named. So substitution on its own, yes, we take you out, but there are other linked questions within there that could come back and still hold you to be a deemed employee in those circumstances.
Okay, we have a question from Paddy. I think I know which Paddy this is. I live in Stornoway and work in Edinburgh. Flight costs are high. How will that work and impact on me? That's a tax question, I think.
It's a tax question, and it goes back to the example I got. Unfortunately, travel costs, that will be regarded as an ordinary commute. So accommodation, travel costs, non-allowable for tax purposes. So those will need to be paid out of your after-tax income if you're caught under the new rules as a deemed employee. That's a very sore one.
There's a question from Nicholas. Retainers are questionable as well. Isn't that a normal form of business-to-business relationships? Well, yes, in the past it has been. And will it continue? Yes. But however, whenever we're talking about retainers with regard to the delivery of the work from a PSC perspective and IR35 in mind, the retainer is actually going to work against you because it potentially could give you that linkage and that stability, in my view, with regard to that permanency. And that could be a catch. So from my perspective, personal opinion would be to stay away from retainers. What do you feel, Stuart?
I'm probably the same. I think that you would probably not want to give an opportunity where this could be challenged. And I go back to, on its own, it's not fatal to any determination status, but when you've got to look and see what other factors are ticked that support it. And my inclination would be to sit and keep retainers out of any future contracts.
Okay, we're narrowing down in time here, guys, but questions are fired in fast and furious at the minute. Another one from Stephen. Could a PSC be engaged to create the statement of work and deliverables before re-engaging the work or before engaging on the work? In my view, yes, but what you would need is a statement of work around the statement of work. And in essence, detailing what you're doing with the view that that would be a preamble, in essence, for the bigger piece. So I think, in theory, my answer would be yes, you could do that as long as it is spec'd out appropriately and the clear deliverables are fitted, Steve.
So I think we maybe do one or two other questions, but something that I probably actually just want to bring forward at this stage as an additional note is the revenue themselves have indicated that they will not go back and look at previous years. Now, it's not that I would take that with a pinch of salt, but I think what's important, and again, this looks for people that are looking to renegotiate their relationships, or even for those that are actually looking to take these people on as contractors on as deemed employees. If you are looking to do that, change the contract just now. And the reason for that is if the contract that's in place just now just rolls on, and the individual is then deemed to be an employee, then in my view, that opens it up that HMRC themselves can then go back and look at earlier years and say, well, there's an acceptance of the situation from 6th of April 2020, that must also have been in place beforehand. So that's really a word of warning for me, I think, to engagers and end clients in this situation.
We have less than a minute to go, guys, so I think this will be the final question. I think we can both cover this one, Stuart. Does an agency have to pay into a personal bank account after taking off PAYE? So this would be a personal services company doing the work, contracted as such with a worker, and they've been inside IR35 and deductions have been made to be paid a personal account. My feeling is no, because, and this is yet to be specified as far as I am aware, because the whole processing of the data around payments through the RTI system direct to the HMRC is all validated on the back of a national insurance number, from what I know. With that, if we're making payments against a company but yet reporting an RTI against the national insurance number, there's a disconnect there. Now, my understanding is at the minute there is no clarity as yet with regard to that, and this is where the final legislation could ultimately define it. At this moment in time, we can't accurately answer it, but it is a great point that I've thought myself, Mark.
Yeah, and I think that's there. Unfortunately, in many of the practical mechanics of what we've got, that we're going to need to wait for the legislation to come forward, and I suspect wait for the revenue seminars that we've got, and they will start to roll out more on the practical operations of the situation.
Our hour has went fast. It's not the most riveting subject to some, but it's ultra important to us all. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us. We've got other questions that we haven't been able to answer. We're going to try and get emails back to you in the course of the next 48 hours. But certainly you've got our contact details there. Feel free to reach out and touch base with either one of us should you wish to have personal discussions around either of the subjects. But thank you very much from both of our perspectives, and thanks very much to Stuart. Sterling job and great advice. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Stu.
Have a good afternoon. Is that the screen you could see there?